Okay, so I'm going to do a quick review of this article from Barbara L. Grabowski from Penn State University. It's called Generative Learning Contributions to the Design of Instruction and Learning. It's an article that was part of the Week 2 assignment for IDT 873 at Old Dominion with Dr. John Backey. So I'm going to say right off the bat, I really like this article. I think the article itself was interesting because it did two things. One, it explained generative theory very well, which seems to be centered around the research of Whitrock, which was in the 70s, and they kind of expand upon it. But what it also does, which I thought was really interesting, is if you notice when reading it, because it's got a lot of examples, I believe what the intention of Dr. Grabowski was to actually make a generative article, right? So not only to talk about generative speech, but the specific choices she made in her writing and in the diagrams and specifics, I think was an intention to teach this in a generative way. And I'll kind of go through what I think about that. But ultimately, the reason I like this article right off the bat is it's written, I think it's written very well. Clearly, they've put a lot of thought into it, and I appreciate that. One of the things that's right off the bat really is they're incredibly straightforward in their introduction. They lay it out. Dr. Grabowski lays it out very clearly that generative lives in this space where, I'll use their words exactly, is designers who hold the belief that both the learner and learning environments are of equal importance, that intentionality on the part of the designer and the learner is critical. That right there is, so it's a mix of behavioral, cognitive, even a little constructivist, and for me and my purposes, that's really important because with the objectives that are normally done in my training programs, it is that mix. And so that's why I appreciate that, because it's there. It isn't just behavioral, just the environment matters, and it's not just cognitive, just the inside matters. It is a mixture. It's a balance, and she goes into that quite well. And so she goes into a lot of the Whitrock Foundation, and I really encourage you guys to read the article if you're interested in generative theory at all. Which, if you think there's a balance between behaviorism and cognitivism, I very much think you'll like generative learning principles. But ultimately, she kind of highlights two major examples, and that's Whitrock's conceptualized model, which she kind of shows in a conceptualization, and then Luria's conceptualized model, which goes everywhere from motivations to let me just look it up real quick. Motivations, brain processes, learning processes, and generation processes. And what, maybe I can show you it, and I'm going to eventually get better at making these, but what you can see is they've gone quite into it in these graphs, right? So you can kind of see that. So essentially what they do is they make this little brain map or mind map that shows you, they use the text to give you some exposition into the how and why this generative process differentiates itself from behaviorism and cognitivism, and then at the same time what the differences are. So the subtle difference, which is specifically cited from the article, is in the subtle difference lies in the creation of new understanding of the information by the learner rather than changing of the presented information. And so this kind of gets into similar to cognitivism, where the change is coming from the learner. It's not a change in it's not a change in the outside environment or a change in the results of the learner. It's a change internally, right? But what they're recognizing is there's kind of two paths, right, that kind of get into this. And Luria's example, Luria's picture is actually slightly better in this regard. Well, maybe not better. That might not be the right word. But let's talk about the generative process itself, right? So in this little line here, you can kind of see the process of generative learning. So it's almost like as if this was preamble, so motivational processes, learning processes, right? So this is essentially the intention of the motivation, why you would do something, the learning process, which is how are we orienting, almost the design of the process. How do we get the person to begin to think in the same path that we are thinking of? And then finally, there's the actual generation process, which goes into how, so is ultimately the information from the environment is either coded, okay, which is coded with other information that is also being presented at the same time, right? Or is it being integrated internally, right? So it's almost like if it's completely brand new information, what you're going to do is you're going to code it contextually to the other information you're receiving, right? But you don't necessarily have the basis of background for you to make an internal, you don't have a base of background to have an internal interpretation of that. Or you receive the information and you immediately internalize it, right? So I really like that little nuance, because if you have brand new information, it's probably really easy, and I think we've probably all done this, to code it a specific way. But if that, kind of law of primacy thought process, if you're coding it incorrectly, then it's going to be difficult to get yourself out of there. So it almost gives the instructional designer the opportunity to, in some circumstances, recognize the places in which the learner may have background, and in other cases, not. And that is actually one of the elements that you can kind of clearly see in this article. Because the article is actually really interesting. If you look at the article, obviously I've got a ton of highlights, but you've got essentially 2 solid pages of text, and then the article actually gets a little sparse. And I think what I was speaking to earlier about it trying to be generative is Barbara Grobich, I'm sorry if I'm butchering her name, Grabowski. Dr. Grabowski, I think, is actually coding this information in the beginning, right? Taking you from unknown, right, and essentially laying down the framework of what that unknown is. And then once you have a working vocabulary of how you're going to work within generative learning theory, then they go into these diagrams. And there's several iterations of these diagrams, right, that are from different researchers, Whitrock, Luriak, and then finally there's an additional Whitrock one. And this last Whitrock one is really interesting. So I'll try to zoom. So it's actually quite interesting because it gets very, like, almost to the point of too detailed, right? It's quite detailed, but it's essentially a generative concept map. And in a lot of ways, I think an instructional designer could look at this and determine almost an instructional path based off of generative learning theory, that they could actually build instruction to suit the needs of these things, which I think is really interesting. So it gives the instructional designer, person actually reading this, and the ability to internalize the information that they previously had coded early in the article. And that's why I think Grabowski's writing is really unique in this point. And so ultimately, here are some of the, they have a bunch of examples, and they do go into a tremendous amount of examples, and I'm not going to go too far into that. But what I will emphasize is essentially Whitrock in 1990 claims there's 2 types of learning activities that can be judged as generative. 2, activities that generate organizational and reorganizational relationships among different components of the environment. And this is titles, headings, questions, objectives, summaries, graphs, tables, main ideas. Whereas those that generate integrated relationships between the external stimuli and the memory components include demonstrations, metaphors, analogies, examples, pictures, applications. And ultimately, what this all leads to is an activity, and this is a quote, an activity must involve meaning making to qualify as generative, right? So meaning making. And I'm actually going to take a little bit from Driscoll's theory of learning, which is actually in page 14 of Driscoll. But that's actually very close to how she defines meaning. Meaning means important to you, whether that's important to or important to the learner, right? So important in the sense of, hey, this is obviously, I'm coding this because I identified this as important for this particular lesson, or B, this is important because I have previous experience and I'm coding it into something that I'm already familiar with. And so what's fantastic after that is they've gotten through the theory, and then for pages and pages, and this is why I think this is a really good article. Just another reason is they do a, that's going to be hard to see because of the rotation, but they go into a straight up comparison, like just direct comparison and a really nice graph between generative learning theory, Whitrock's 92, behaviorism, Skinner 1990, connectionism, Whitrock 92, schema theory, Rumelhart 81, information processing, Bell Grelder, and constructivism, Johansson 1991. I mean, it's like line for line. This is what this is. This is what this is. Obviously, at the discretion of what Grabowski thinks, but I think it's really a really good tool to kind of show the differences, because obviously we're utilizing a lot of the same words, or words that could easily be seen as synonyms. So I think it's important to give that contextual differences at the same time, while first explaining what generative theory is, because that's obviously why you're essentially reading the article. After they get into this really interesting part about applied research, again, which I really liked, because it is almost like a learning tool. Like I genuinely think you could probably use this article as a tool to design instruction from a generative standpoint. Yeah, you're not, because it gets very, very detailed in ideas. So whether that's creating adjunct post questions, post questions, pictures, organizational headings, concepts versus schematic maps, concept maps, even mouse manipulated graphics, individual and group concept mapping. Gets into some very interesting stuff where they get into the generative activity, the author of that information, the dependent variables, the content, the age, and the results of the information. So you could, it's a pretty substantive review of the available information, which I think is really great. And then after they get into this really nice chart they have here, after you get into this nice chart, if you want the exposition, they go very much into the exposition of each individual element of those charts. So you can kind of pick and choose what's going to work for you and come back to it, and not necessarily have to reread the entire, 35-page article. It finishes off with a really nice, I think a really nice summary, actually a short summary, but a nice summary that essentially comes down to two elements. One that I thought was really, really good is ultimately the control of the learning experience should be put, and as the quote, following Whitlock's principles, one should put the control of learning in the hands of the learner by creating an advisory environment in which learners manipulate information by moving text, graphics, media segments around mentally or physically, testing their ideas. This does not mean placing the learner in a total learner-controlled information environment, but rather in one which success can be guided, rewarded, and reinforced. Secondarily, the second important message from Whitlock is that more time and effort needs to be spent on identifying important factors about the learner than is traditionally spent in instructional design process. And so it's enforcing that the only way to do this is to do the work ultimately. You're going to have a solid persona design, and then you're going to have you're going to want to make sure that first you're really trying to understand. And the reason we're trying to understand, again, is those two things. Either the person's going to code it, the learner is going to code the information because the information is somewhat abstract to them and has no bearing in their personal experience thus far, or it's going to be experiential, in which they are going to immediately integrate into their already working knowledge. And I think if we look at whether the class is an initial class, a recurring class, an enrichment class, anything like that, I think you have a good opportunity to use generative theory in either case, which is what I really like about it, because it does take elements from both sides. So ultimately, the article, again, is sorry, it was large. Generative Learning Contributions to Design of Instruction and Learning by Barbara Grabowski. Really fantastic article. I'm happy Dr. Backy suggested it. Give it a look. Have a good one.